promised myself I would take a moment and take you in. It's good to see everybody. And thank you, Carrie, not only for that generous introduction, but for the last year and a half of excited conversation back and forth. I'm going to give you just, I think Carrie's given you the gist of it. I'll talk for a short while. We'll have a time for comments, questions, and take a break. After the break, there'll be a men's fishbowl with men talking about their experiences. The men will just sit down and the women will then come up and talk about what in the world it was they just heard. And then the men will come back up and join the women for a conversation with each other. Same format we used in a training institute recently, and I think people thought it went very well. A couple of notes on language as I start. I will refer to men in the third person. I am aware that I am included in that group. And the other is I want to be clear that I am talking pretty exclusively about heterosexual couples, not in a sense of being oblivious or thinking that all couples are heterosexual, but that these dynamics particularly take place in heterosexual couples for reasons that I hope will become clear. I've been working on these ideas for about 10 years. And this is the phase in the process where I sort of start talking to other people about it, which just always makes me a little nervous, but is exciting as well. And where it started for me is I went through some changes in my life and started having a lot of men in my practice, just as you know, unusual. And if you work with men, you know that a lot of what they do is complain about their partners. They have a long series of complaints about their partners. And like a good therapist, I would ask, have you talked to your partner about any of this? And the response was pretty consistent. Mostly they looked at me like I had just asked the stupidest question in the history of the world. Like, talk to her, are you kidding? I would never do that. And it slowly started to dawn on me that they were scared to talk to her. And so I started using the words scared and afraid in sessions. And again, the response was pretty consistent. First I got the bow up, you know, the I'm not scared, which lasted usually less than 30 seconds. And was then followed with a, that's an interesting idea. And then stuff would start opening up. It seemed like a helpful word to use to help men to open to a lot of new ideas. So on the face of it, it seems kind of a counterintuitive idea. Men afraid of women. We know that women are afraid of men, and for damn good reason. We've given them a lot of reasons to be afraid of us. But what do men have to be afraid of? Margaret Atwood has my favorite quote on the matter. Atwood said, "Men are afraid women will laugh at them. Women are afraid men will kill them." Men are socialized to not acknowledge fear of any kind. And the most prohibited fear for a man is to acknowledge being afraid of a woman. So for men, the idea of fear of a woman is preconscious. For women, it is almost entirely unconscious. In the 10 years I've been talking about these ideas, men usually get it pretty quickly. Women look at me like I'm from another planet. Like they really don't understand what I'm talking about. Hopefully by the end of today, they will. It's complicated to talk about men being afraid of women because we tend to think that only disadvantaged people are afraid, as if privilege somehow were an inoculation against fear, that privileged people don't have fear. In this particular area, it's not only complicated, it's a bit tricky, because we're talking about how people in privileged positions are harmed by the systems they created to take advantage of other people, which is a tricky thing to do without sounding as if you were justifying bad behavior on the part of people in privileged positions. As Martin Luther King said, segregation scars the soul of the perpetrator as well as the perpetrator. The other thing that's tricky in this conversation is that we tend to think when we talk and say one person is scared, we tend to instinctively think that someone has done something to scare them, that there's someone to blame. And so our task today is to talk about men's fears of women without blaming women. Men are not scared of women because of something women did to them. Men are scared of women because we all live in the same patriarchy that for men leads to that place. But it is important, despite all those caveats, it is really important to talk about this, because as you start thinking this way, as the ideas start to permeate your thinking, I think you'll find that these ideas have an awful lot to do with what drives the internal lives of men, and therefore have a lot to do with the dynamics in straight couples. Men have been talking about their fears of powerful women for as long as there's been history. Eve brought about the downfall from the garden. Pandora unleashed evil into the world. The list goes on. Delilah. Lots of stories about men destroying women, women destroying men, or even destroying the entire world. What's interesting is most cultures have some version of what in Spanish is called vagina dentata, which is a vagina with teeth, which is an interesting image because it means that intimacy with a woman risks castration. Let me give you some contemporary examples to do two things. One is to help you locate the experience in yourself and to bring it into the room so that we're not so abstract. We're talking about something that hopefully you all have some connection with. John's in a committed relationship with Susan. Friends ask John to get together after work and go for a drink. It bothers John that his first thought is not about whether or not he wants to go out with his friends, but his first thought is whether Susan will mind. Susan has nothing to do with this. Susan is supportive of John going out with friends. In fact, she often encourages him because she knows how few friends he has, and she understands that her life would go better if he had more friends. So she's never in any way suggested that she's unhappy with John going out with friends. But he can't shake the thought in calling her. He's nervous because he feels like he's doing something wrong in asking to go out with friends. I'll give you another example. Mark and Barbara, in a committed relationship together, started out as pretty hot and heavy. Sex was exciting. They had a lot of it, frequently, and enjoyed it very much. Over time, the frequency starts to fall off, and both of them start to feel like, it's like more like checking something off the list rather than something that they're excited to do. Mark, however, still thinks of himself as a very sexually alive person. He masturbates frequently. He's turned on by other women. He masturbates to images of women who don't look a lot like his wife. And he fantasizes about sexual acts that don't look a lot like what he and Barbara do. He's particularly drawn to images of women who are insatiable in their sexual desire, women who are very open about their expression of desire. But when Barbara is a little open about her sexual desire with him, he gets very nervous and turned on. One more example. A couple, Bill and Mary had horrible sleep apnea, like life-threatening, needs treatment immediately, and snored terribly. And Bill lay next to her, unable to sleep for a long period of time, and finally convinced Mary to go and get a sleep study. Mary goes and gets a sleep study, and they interrupt the sleep study. The sleep apnea is so bad, they're afraid she's going to die on the table. They don't even finish the study. It's then a year from then before Mary gets the CPAP machine. During that year, Bill slept next to Mary in the same bed every night, unable to sleep, rageful, and here's the kicker. Their oldest kid had already gone to school. There was an empty bedroom right down the hall. He was so, and nor did Mary ever say, I don't want you to sleep in another bedroom. In his mind, going to sleep in another bedroom was a betrayal of the marital contract, and so he lay there for a year, afraid to get up and go sleep in the other room. Any of those sound familiar?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to suggest that there are 7 categories of fears. I see them talking. 7 categories of fears, and I say this knowing there aren't 7 categories. It's not like there's a line someplace where I really say this to you in a sense to help sort of structure our thinking about it. Would you put the slide up of the... So I'm going to suggest that these categories move from those that are more conscious and socially acceptable down towards those that are less conscious and less socially acceptable. In other words, that they build on each other. The first fear is men are afraid that women will dominate and control them. So the worst thing that one man can accuse another of is being pussy-whipped, which is a phrase that I find fascinating. Just visually, it's an interesting phrase. I'm not quite sure how the whip comes in. But it's interesting that the worst thing that a straight man can say to another straight man is not just that you're controlled by women, but that you're controlled by your need for women, which is an interesting idea. And in that idea, of course, a great deal of power is ascribed to women. Women can control you with your need of them. And it leads to one of the ideas about masculinity we've developed, which is that to need a woman is to be less of a man and to be emasculated by your need for a woman. This has led, one of the consequences of this idea is what's being increasingly talked about as an epidemic of loneliness, primarily in men. If you haven't read Thomas Joyner's book, Lonely at the Top, I highly recommend it. Second fear I want to talk about is the fear of being trapped by women. Lyle Lovett wrote a song. First verse of the song is, the preacher asked her, and she said, I do. The preacher asked me, and she said, yes, he does too. The preacher said, I pronounce you 99 to life. She's no lady, she's my wife. Captures it well, I think. And I got a chance to sing. Men are socialized to think that women are trying to trap them in marriage, which is an interesting idea because every piece of information we have documents that marriage works a whole lot better for men than it does for women. For example, married men are healthier, wealthier, and happier than single men. But single women are happier, wealthier, and happier than married women. Married men are happier than married women, and unmarried women are happier than married men. Yet the idea persists. Next category is men are afraid that they will fail in their responsibility to protect and provide for women. A very big part of the masculine identity, stereotypically, is that it's your job to protect and provide. In a survey of 5,000 men, said that their biggest fear in relationship was that they would disappoint their partner, not being good enough, failing to make them happy. You don't have to think about this too long to understand that that stems from a very deep insecurity on the part of many men. Because the idea that men are taught is that their value is not in their person, but in their function. That their value to any other person is not who they are, but what they do for that person in the acts of service they provide for that person. So that if you are no longer providing and protecting, who would want you? Men are scared. This will not come as a surprise to you. Men are scared of women's emotions. I know you know that. Men are afraid when women have strong feelings of any kind, including joy, which is confusing to women, I think. And those feelings don't have to be about the man. They just have to be to make men nervous. One of the reasons that men are scared of feelings in women is that we're, of course, scared about feelings in ourselves. And so emotions are contagious. And when you're around people who are having strong feelings, you feel more of what you're trying to not feel. Moving now more to the fears that are increasingly unconscious. Men are afraid that they will be discovered to be inadequate. That particularly that they'll be disclosed as being inadequate emotionally and interpersonally. Men understand, intuitively if not overtly, that they are not as well developed emotionally as most women. And so they know that when they go into an intimate relationship with a woman, they're often at a disadvantage or feel as if they are. And they're accustomed to being in advantage positions in the world, and so it is an uncomfortable place for men to be in an intimate setting where they feel disadvantaged. One of the deeper fears for men is the fear of being a man. Again, if your justification for existence is being useful, then that sort of makes clear that you believe that if you were not continuing to be useful, that you would not be loved. And this is what underlies what we've all seen as a sort of remarkable avoidance of conflict in men. What extent men will go to avoid conflict in a relationship because it threatens the fear of abandonment. That's why Bill, of course, lay next to Mary for a year rather than saying, I want to go someplace and get some sleep. And the fear that I think is at the bottom, the one ring to rule them all, the fear that underlies all these fears is femophobia, which is the fear of the feminine aspects of oneself and the fear of being seen as feminine by another man or by anyone. And the reason that this fear is so powerful is that, I'll talk more later about the concept of fragile masculinity, which is the idea that women are born women, and men are not. That masculinity is not something that's inherently true of you, but something that you have to, not only do you have to earn, and you earn it by demonstrating that you're not feminine. That masculinity is defined as not feminine, and that one small slip-up undoes all of the careful work you've done to prove to yourself and to others that you're masculine. So that men can never rest, men can never relax, because they're always at risk of facing the feminine parts of themselves. I would like to now play a brief video for you. I'm sure all of you have seen this. Can we dim the lights and play the video? This is the Tronic still face experiment. A lot of you have probably seen it, but I think watching it will sort of recapture as we try to talk about where these fears come from. Can we play that?
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here.
it's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Thank you. Bring the lights back up. So it's been a long time since I was an infant, and I've seen that video a lot of times, and it still bothers me. Interestingly, and we don't know why, but the male infants in the study were more dysregulated than the female, and it took them longer to reconnect and feel okay, which makes sense if you look at the research that says that in adult heterosexual conflict, in terms of physiological arousal, men get more distressed, just like they did there. Men get more physiologically upset in heterosexual conflict, and it takes them longer to re-stabilize. So the infants, if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy, translates pretty seamlessly to the adult, happy wife, happy life. And if we really want to understand on a visceral level what's going on in adult heterosexual relationships, just think back to this video. So why? How does this happen? Why are men afraid of women? Well, I think the person who's written the best stuff about this is, for blocking her last name, first name, Dinnerstein, old book, The Mermaid and the Minotaur. It's a wonderful book. And Mermaid and the Minotaur, Minotaur. And what Dinnerstein suggests is that one thing that hasn't changed that much is that most babies are taken care of primarily by women. That's still true. And that means that our first, earliest post-birth experiences of attachment and bliss and union are with a woman. Mom can take away the pain with a single kiss. Mom can calm terror with a single embrace and bring elusive sleep. Those are powerful, deeply ingraining experiences as an infant. But then there is the inevitable fall from the garden. Nobody can provide seamless caretaking. There are always dysregulated moments when the caretaker is distracted or unavailable or possibly even withholding or punishing. And so that means then that our first experiences also of pain and frustration and disappointment are also with a woman, likely to be, for most people, with a woman. It's with the woman that most of us first experience the experience of needing something from someone who is either inconsistent in providing it or perhaps even neglectful or withholding. As we saw in the Tronic video, mothers and infants engage in a conversation. There's clearly a conversation going on between them. What are they talking about? They're trying to figure out what I can do that will secure attachment behavior from you and what I do that puts it at risk. So we begin early in life training ourselves to be less than fully ourselves because we start to forsake behaviors that don't work. Oh, mom didn't pay any attention to that, so I don't need that behavior. And the behaviors that elicit attachment are, of course, reinforced and get bigger. So, but that's all the same. What's that got to do with men? That's the same. Women are in the same babies. Girl babies are in the same exact situation. Two things that differ. Straight men partner with someone who is the same gender as their first caretaker. And so all of those early dynamics get reenacted in their romantic relationships. For women, that happens with other women. Sisters, friends. So the intensity that men feel with women experience with other women. The other thing that's different is that as boys grow up, dads come into the picture. This is changing a lot, I'm happy to say, but it's still true that dads are often not as comfortable with infants who don't do things, you know, they don't play golf, they don't whatever. They just, it's an unconscious to unconscious relationship that men are often not as, and how many times have you heard a man say, yeah, well, I'm more comfortable with my child now because he talks and we can play together. So as dads come into the picture more, they represent access to the external world that is clearly there for boys, which is the world of power and privilege. Dads clearly have access to that, and boys can see that if they identify as a man, that they will have access to the world of power and privilege. I want to tell you a wonderful story about a coming-of-age ritual. Most cultures, many cultures, have coming-of-age rituals. And in most of them, well, I'll just take this particular one, but a lot of it overlaps with many cultures. So young boys live in the hut with their mothers until puberty. Men live by themselves, women live by themselves. At some age, the men decide that the boy is ready for initiation into the world of men. So they dress up in scary costumes and they make, you know, scary expressions, and they come in the middle of the night and they symbolically kidnap the boy and they bring him out into the jungle, where usually the rites involve some form of torture, literally, scarification. And then they bring the now man back to the village where he will get his things. But in this particular ritual, there's an interesting wrinkle. In this culture, when the young boys come back to the village, their mother meets them at the edge of the village, and he is instructed to slap her and then go to the women's hut, get his things, and move into the men's hut. So my question to you is, what's the slap for? Why not just go to the hut, get your stuff, and go to the men's hut? What's the purpose of the slap? That was an actual question, not sure. What do you think? What is?
Cut off attachment.
Can't hear you, Bruce.
Certain dominance.
Over the woman?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cut off attachment.
Yes, exactly. Should cut off attachment. Because he is demonstrating to the other men that he doesn't need his mother. Because the price of admission to masculinity is to forsake all attachments to mother and any aspect of yourself that might be seen as feminine. The other reason, I think, is that if he didn't slap her, now remember, he's a little boy who just got tortured in the woods by scary men. I think if he didn't slap her, he would go running into her arms and say, take me back. So I think it's also for him to toughen up and harden himself to his own yearnings, to be tender with a woman. It creates an unsolvable dilemma for men. It really becomes a forced choice for men between the tenderness and intimacy and openness that they've learned in the woman's hut and the hard, competitive, aggressive world of power that their father is inviting. And they are non-overlapping. Admission to one. Can't own two homes here. You are expected to sell and act like you never lived in the other one to gain admission to the first. So men are drawn to women and frightened of them for the same exact reasons. Because women evoke in men those same early yearnings, and because women evoke in men those same early yearnings. So this is why men use hypermasculine defenses in an attempt to resolve this unsolvable dilemma. And these hypermasculine defenses impoverish men emotionally and interpersonally. And the thing that's currently of great interest to me is how impaired most men are in their capacity for pleasure. Think about it. If you think about either yourself or men you know, how little pleasure most men have in their lives. I don't mean productive pleasure, I mean just pleasure. So that Dorothy Dimstein makes a fairly radical statement that she believes that the patriarchy is actually more harmful to men in this way than to women. So what I want to do now is to give you another case example. And these are amalgamations, by the way, they're not actual. And I want to use it to sort of compare and contrast a traditional psychodynamic understanding of couples dynamics to an understanding with this perspective in mind. Bob and Mary are in a committed relationship, and they're in conflict. They're having an argument. Mary feels hurt and angry. She's upset with Bob for not helping enough around the house and with the kids. Her complaints are on a fairly concrete behavioral level, but really she's upset that she has to be in charge of everything, and that she always has to ask for help. And what she really wants from Bob is a sense of partnership, a sense of being in it together. Having to stay on top of him all the time makes Mary feel more like Bob's mother than his partner. From Bob's perspective, he does plenty to help. I had a guy tell me recently, with a straight face, straight guy with a straight face, that he works 60 hours at his job, and his wife works 40 hours at her job and 20 hours taking care of the family, so why aren't those the same? Why is she complaining that he's not? And I asked him, I said, well, how would you feel about switching? And he was horrified. He said, okay, I get it. They seemed equivalent until he thought about it. Then somehow the math didn't add up to it. So to Bob, it seems like Mary is always critical of him, always pointing out the ways he's been inadequate and failed to please her. To Bob, it seems like a rigged game. Like she keeps, I hear a lot of guys talk about moving the goalposts. You know, like just when he figures out what to do right, then she moves the goalposts and he can never win. Bob can see that Mary's upset, but his tears, her tears, make him uncomfortable. He'd like to feel empathic, and it bothers him that he doesn't. But something about her strong feelings makes him uncomfortable. To a traditional explanation, Bob sounds a lot like an avoidantly attached man. And Mary sounds a lot like an anxiously attached woman. We could go with that. In fact, Gottman suggests that 70% of couples conflict is the result of avoidantly attached men partnered with anxiously attached women. I think that's correct from one lens, but it's from a psychodynamic lens, not an interpersonal relational lens. And here's the way I would say that. Men are socialized to use avoidant defenses. And women learn pretty quickly that anxiety is an effective way to get an avoidant man to re-engage. So I want to get it right because I get this backwards. Any avoidant man can make a woman look anxious, and any anxious woman can make a man look avoidant. So although it ends up looking like avoidant men with anxious women, so we know that the attachment styles are about equally spread among people, so it doesn't make sense that all the conflict is in that pairing, but that's why it looks that way. So there may be a different way of thinking about it. Intimate relationships are a lot like our bodies. If you don't stretch them, they get stiff and rigid and inflexible. And in couples, in heterosexual couples, women are increasingly drawn into the role of the emotionally needy person who is chronically disappointed in her partner and complaining about the lack of intimacy in the relationship. Men are often drawn into the role of the emotionally stoic one who's withdrawn and feels criticized by their partner. Why does it break out that way? Carol Gilligan, a long time ago, brilliantly talked about, at a certain age, boys and girls move from same-sex playgroups from mixed playgroups to same-sex playgroups. Girls go off with each other, and they do what? They practice relationships. They play house, they play all kinds of games, all of which are about relationships. They get a lot better at it. Boys go off, practice competition and aggression. Boys are prepared for their role to run the world. And so they practice competition and aggression. And then when puberty comes and boys get interested in girls again, they don't know what the hell the girls are talking about. They've missed all the episodes that happened while they were gone. They don't know where they are in the show, they don't know how to do it, and they don't know what the rules are. It's pretty puzzling. Men learn from their fathers that the way to please a woman is through acts of service. That the way to forestall disappointing a woman is through acts of service. They learn to feel good about themselves as men to the extent to which they, it was up here, protect and provide for women. If your partner is upset and you can't fix it, it's understood by men as a failing as a man. Women learn from their mothers to settle for acts of service as a not very satisfactory substitution for intimacy. And they're taught by their mothers to not expect much from men and to lower their expectations as a way to protect themselves from feeling disappointed. This is a pretty stable pattern for most couples, and it actually works relatively well for a while because it allows each person to feel like they can give and receive love. And it works as long as women get enough of what the intimacy they want through acts of service, and men don't feel too threatened by the level of conflict in the relationship, evoking their fears of abandonment. So back to our couple. Although Mary is upset about not feeling a true sense of partnership with Bob, she knows from experience that trying to talk to him directly about it is not going to go well. He'll get defensive. So she learns to talk around it. So she talks to Bob about not helping around the house. But what she's really talking with him about is how lonely she feels and how much she wants to feel a sense of partnership with him. She complains to Bob that he doesn't spend enough time with the family, but what she's really trying to talk about is missing him and wanting to feel closer. But no matter how careful Mary is, Bob is still likely to feel criticized and defensive because any unhappiness on the part of a woman to a man is likely to feel like a failing as a man. On some level, Bob does understand that what Mary wants is not exactly what she's asking for because, of course, it's what he wants. He had a mother. He understands an intimate connection to a woman. It's what he wants as well. But his fears of being responsible for Mary and being inadequate to please her make it difficult for him to hear Mary's approach as an invitation, and more likely that he will hear it as a demand or a criticism. Bob feels scared and threatened and begins to withdraw because it's what men are taught to do when they feel scared. He doesn't have the skills, he doesn't have the experience, he doesn't know what Mary's looking for or how to give it to her. So he starts withdrawing the acts of service that he's been expressing his caring for. Why does he do less of them? Because they're not working. They're not pleasing her. They're not reducing the conflict in the relationship. So why get her coffee every morning if it's not working? Because men hide their fears so well, Mary interprets Bob's withdrawal as withholding. Why isn't he doing these things he used to do? He's mad at her. He's withholding. And Mary's left to conclude that either she's too needy and demanding, or Bob's just incapable of giving her what she needs. As Bob becomes even less available, Mary gets increasingly distressed, leading to more conflict in the couple. The fights become less productive and more hurtful. Paradoxically, Mary's not that upset with it because actually contact through conflict can feel better than no contact at all. But for Bob, it's not that way at all. For Bob, the very thing he's working hardest to avoid is happening more and more. Mary's feelings are trading all the feelings that Bob has been working so hard to suppress. So Bob escalates to the next line of defense, to try to retain his own emotional equilibrium, to try to take the emotions out of the situation by becoming hyper-rational and insisting that Mary do the same. So he reassures her, tries to analyze her dissatisfaction, come up with creative solutions to them, and of course Bob is very upset that his brilliant idea is not only not helpful, but makes things much, much worse. Bob's doing everything he can to take care of Mary, to help her by solving her problems, and yet it just seems to make her more and more upset. The more controlled and stoic Bob becomes, the more upset Mary gets. The more Bob withdraws, the more Mary pursues. So then Bob goes on the offensive and decides to cut off the problem at the source by trying to contain Mary's level of feeling. So if he can't modulate his own reactivity, I could stop the problem at the source. And so he begins to shame Mary for her feelings, criticizes her as being too emotional, hysterical, blowing things out of proportion. None of you have ever heard any of these. Holds himself up as the adult logical, as if there were a playbook for couples conflict, and he has it, and she doesn't, and he's going to painstakingly teach her how conflict is in a relationship. Now, from a traditional perspective, it is true that Bob is trying to control Mary. But what he's mostly trying to control is his own fear. So men and women in heterosexual relationships can end up working at cross purposes, with women working to create more contact and connection, and men working to try to soothe their own level of fear. Let me close by saying something about, not just leave you with that bleak picture, but saying something about, we're a room full of therapists, so let me talk a little bit about particular ideas about how to work with these issues with men and with couples. I want to talk about three things. One is men working with men, the other is men working with each other, and the third is couples. So in terms of men's work, the first, we would all agree, I'm sure, that the first task in psychotherapy is establishing an alliance. That's hard with men. Whitaker always said, when you see a family, you got to make a connection with your dad first, because that's going to make or break the work. So the first problem is, of course, that men don't always come to therapy fully voluntarily. They're often coerced, if not outright threatened, if they don't go to therapy. But more importantly and more problematic is that men understand that therapy kind of isn't for them. Whether the therapist is male or female, the values of psychotherapy are largely the values that they've been told they have to forsake in order to be a man. Emotional openness, vulnerability, these are all things men are taught don't do. And they know that. They understand that therapy will create what Jim O'Neill called gender role conflict. Therapy will, and typically men, particularly if it's couples therapy, what men anticipate is that it will just become 2 against 1. That the therapist will support all of the things that his wife's been saying to him, and he'll feel ganged up on. So the first task then is to create an alliance with men that does not involve the therapist's attachment to those values. So you have to first engage men around what might be in it for them, and hear from them what their concerns are about therapy and what they think they might gain from being in therapy. The second thing I would say with men, working with men, is that men are socialized to lead with competition and aggression, and so they're likely to carry that same dynamic into therapy and to try to create some kind of power struggle with the therapist. A wise person once said that psychotherapy can be summarized by simply not getting into a power struggle with the patient, and that's particularly true with men. To never allow yourself to be engaged in a power struggle, but to, in a sense, work with the resistance. And then as I talked about, I think it's very helpful with men to look for opportunities to introduce the words scared or afraid, which will get a quick reaction, but then I think opens to a lot of other feelings. And typically men begin to understand that most of the things that are bothering them in their lives are not from being afraid, but from all of the defenses that they habitually use to protect themselves from feeling, and that talking about feeling afraid is typically experienced by most men as very relieving. The last thing I'll say about working with men is to help men understand the relationship between anger and fear. Men are socialized. Anger is the only acceptable emotion for men, and so it's often helpful for men to help them see the fear that underlies what they would call anger. A couple of examples. When you're angry at being criticized by your partner, that you can't ever seem to get it right, it might be that you're scared that you'll never be able to please him and she'll leave you. Or when you're angry that the kids always come first with your partner and she never seems to have time for you, it might be that you're scared that she knows how to be close with the kids in ways that you really don't, and that the kids love her more than they love you. As you begin to open these issues up with men, it gets them more in touch with their own dependency, which is largely disowned. And it activates and exaggerates their fear of abandonment. And of course, absolutely no amount of reassurance from their partner is helpful with this at all. So this is a time when I often refer men to groups, which I will then talk about men working with each other. I started doing men's groups 10 years or so ago, and I remember distinctly the night before the first group, I thought, this is the worst idea I have ever had. I'm going to be pulling teeth the whole time. They're going to talk about sports. Well, I have never been more wrong. What I learned is men are dying to talk to each other. They're just scared to do it with women in the room. So I still run 2 men's groups. Those groups are the only groups that, well, before the pandemic, that people hugged routinely in the group and talk openly about loving each other, are the groups I do with men. So normally, people who don't do groups make bad referrals to group because they take the worst patients who can't do work in therapy and refer them to group, which is not helpful to those people who do groups. But with men, it's an okay thing to do. And you can take men who really don't know how to do therapy and don't know how to talk about themselves and put them in a group with other men, and they get a lot because they listen to other men talking about feelings and open, and they get it without feeling the kind of pressure that they experience in individual or, God forbid, couples therapy. Work for women. One of the big surprises to me has been that I just, not a woman, so I didn't understand how much benefit this understanding has been for women. Because what women have been telling me is that understanding the fear, so they interpret their partner's withdrawal as punishment, as withholding. And understanding the fear that lies underneath it has really allowed women to be more compassionate towards their partners. Let me read you a quote from a woman from a workshop. As a woman, it didn't dawn on me much that I had any impact at all on men, much less to be able to scare them. I came to understand my own rage as I heard it echoed in a variety of emotions and experiences of other women, in feeling dismissed, hurt, ignored, not taken seriously, not stood up to by their partners. But even more profoundly, to understand that the men in the group were not ignoring, dismissing, or hurting their female partners on purpose or out of a lack of respect, as I suspected. Instead, they were scared. Scared to hurt us, to mess up with us, to not be enough. I had honestly never in my life heard men talk this way, to articulate that the women in their lives were so profoundly important to them that they were constantly terrified we'd leave them. So for women, the work begins with refraining from using criticism as a way of re-engaging with partners because it doesn't work, and learning how to express themselves relationally, i.e. in the context of the relationship, not acontextually, but to be engaged with their partner and watch what his reaction is. They're talking about their feelings so that it's more productive. I think I'm going to stop there and leave some time for your thoughts. I think we've got like 10, 15 minutes for your thoughts and questions.